She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Sweetheart, this isn't a homework assignment, Vanessa Cole." Let the laugh travel around the boardroom table before she even looked at the boy who'd caused it. Marcus Webb, 23 years old, second week on the job, wearing a jacket that still had the fold lines from the store, stood at the head of the table, with a laser pointer trembling slightly in his hand. He had just told the chief strategy officer of Halden Dynamics, in front of 6 investors and a live feed to 2 more, that slide 14 of her pitch deck was wrong. Not stylistically wrong, mathematically wrong. He did not know yet that within 11 days the company would be worth nothing without the correction he'd just made, or that the algorithm they were about to sell to a room full of strangers had his name buried in a commit log Vanessa had never bothered to open. Marcus had been hired as a data visualization intern, the kind of job that exists mostly so a company can say it invests in young talent, and mostly involves formatting other people's charts. So they look expensive. He was good at it. In the quiet, overqualified way of someone doing a fraction of what he's capable of because the fraction is what's on offer. He had graduated top of his class in applied mathematics 18 months earlier, and he had turned down 2 funded graduate offers to take an unpaid research position at a fintech startup that promised him real work and gave him coffee runs instead. When that startup folded the way small companies fold, suddenly and without warning, leaving 3 months of unpaid wages behind it, Marcus had taken the first steady thing he could find. Halden Dynamics paid him $19 an hour to make other people's numbers look prettier. He did not complain about this. He had learned early that complaining rarely changed anything, and that showing up reliably was worth more than most people gave it credit for. He lived with 2 roommates in an apartment above a laundromat, and sent a third of every paycheck to his younger sister, who was still in high school, and living with an aunt who could not always afford the extra mouth. Their mother had died when Marcus was 19, midway through his second year of college, and their father had not been in the picture long before that. Marcus had finished his degree anyway, on scholarships and night shifts, because stopping had never actually occurred to him as an option. He did not tell people this story. It did not come up in interviews, and he had never once used it to explain why he was tired. Vanessa Cole ran the strategy division at Halden Dynamics, and she had built her identity around never being the person who got something wrong in front of a room. She was 38, sharp-featured, and had clawed her way into the C-suite of a company that had, until 3 years ago, been run entirely by men who didn't take her seriously. She had learned to over-prepare, to speak first and speak fastest, and to treat any correction, however small, as a threat to the authority she had built one hard-won meeting at a time. She was not cruel by nature. She had simply decided, a long time ago, that softness was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had stopped being able to tell the difference between defending herself and attacking someone weaker. The pitch that morning was for CoreSight, the predictive routing algorithm that was supposed to be Halden Dynamics' entire future. The company had bet almost everything on it, burned through 2 funding rounds building it, delayed payroll twice to keep the lights on, and this room, this exact 50 minutes, was the last real shot at the capital that would keep CoreSight alive long enough to launch. Vanessa had rehearsed the deck 11 times. She knew every number on every slide, the way a musician knows a piece she's performed for years, which is to say she had stopped actually listening to it. Slide 14 showed the algorithm's projected efficiency gain over its nearest competitor. A clean, confident 34%. Marcus had helped assemble the deck 2 nights earlier, not the numbers, just the formatting, moving boxes, adjusting fonts. And while he'd been polishing the chart, he had done what he always did without meaning to. He'd looked at the math. The 34% figure used a weighting variable from an earlier version of the model, one that had been quietly revised 6 weeks prior after a data correction nobody had bothered to push downstream into the pitch materials. The real number, using the corrected weighting, was closer to 19%. Not a rounding error, a number that would collapse the entire competitive narrative the moment a due diligence analyst on the other side of that table ran it themselves, which, Marcus knew, due diligence analysts always eventually did. He had mentioned it to his supervisor the day before. His supervisor had told him it wasn't his job to worry about the modeling, and to focus on making the chart colors match the brand guide. Marcus had let it go, the way he'd learned to let most things go. But sitting in the back corner of the boardroom that morning, watching Vanessa build toward slide 14 with the same easy confidence she'd used in rehearsal, something in him refused to stay quiet. Not ambition, just the simple, old habit of not being able to watch something wrong get called right. He raised his hand. Vanessa didn't call on him so much as glance in his direction, mildly annoyed at the interruption, expecting a question about clicker functionality. Instead, Marcus said, quietly and without any performance in his voice, that slide 14's efficiency figure used the pre-correction weighting, and that the actual number post-correction was closer to 19%, and that presenting the higher figure to investors who would verify it themselves within the week could expose the company to real liability. The room went still in the particular way. Rooms go still when someone has said something true that nobody wanted said. And then Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to reset the temperature of the room, and told him, in front of everyone, that this wasn't a homework assignment, that the adults in the room had already vetted the numbers, and that perhaps he should focus on his actual job. A couple of the investors smiled, uncertain, the way people smile when they're not sure if they're supposed to. Marcus didn't argue. He said, understood, sat back down, and said nothing else for the rest of the meeting. The pitch closed strong on the surface. Two of the investors expressed real interest, but the third, a quiet man near the end of the table named Aldrich Chen, who ran a fund with a reputation for doing its own math before it did anyone else's, asked, almost as an afterthought on his way out, whether the 34% figure accounted for the June data correction. Vanessa said, of course, it did. Aldrich said he'd have his team confirm that in writing before term sheets went out. He left without raising his voice or his eyebrows, which was somehow worse than if he had. 11 days. That's how long Halden Dynamics had before the confirmation request came back. Before Aldrich's analysts found the gap between what the deck claimed and what the underlying model actually showed. Before every number in the pitch became suspect by association, and before the two other interested investors copied on the same due diligence chain began quietly asking their own question. Vanessa didn't know any of this was coming when she walked back into her office that afternoon, still faintly pleased with how she'd handled the intern thing, already rehearsing how she'd tell the story at drinks that week. Marcus went back to formatting charts. He did not mention the meeting again. He clocked in at 8:15 the next morning, the same as always, made himself unremarkable in the way he'd made himself unremarkable his whole working life. And if anyone had asked him, he would have said he didn't expect anything to come of it. What he did, quietly, that night in his apartment above the laundromat, was rebuild the weighting model from scratch on his own laptop, correct it properly, and write up 2 clean pages showing exactly where the error had entered the pipeline and how to fix it. He didn't send it anywhere. He just wanted, for his own peace of mind, to know he'd been right. 9 days later, the confirmation request landed in Vanessa's inbox, CCing 4 people, asking her to reconcile the June correction with the figures presented in the pitch deck. She read it twice and felt something cold settle in her stomach because she understood immediately, with the particular clarity that arrives too late, exactly what it meant and exactly who had tried to warn her. She spent the next 6 hours in a closed-door meeting with the modeling team trying to figure out how deep the error ran. And the answer, when it finally came back, was all the way down. Every downstream projection in the pitch market share, timeline to profitability. The 34% headline number itself had been built on the uncorrected weighting. It wasn't fraud. It was carelessness. The ordinary kind that happens when a company moves too fast to double-check its own math. But carelessness, in front of investors who'd already started asking questions, reads exactly like something worse. The modeling lead, a woman named Priya Anand who had inherited the pipeline from someone who'd left the company months earlier, sat across from Vanessa looking exhausted and said the one thing Vanessa did not want to hear, that someone had actually caught this already in the room, out loud, in front of everyone, 11 days ago. Vanessa didn't answer right away. She was doing the math in her head the way she always did. Except this time, the math wasn't in her favor. She found Marcus the next morning in the small, windowless room where the interns worked, hunched over a monitor adjusting the color scheme on an unrelated deck. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed her. When he did, he simply said, "Morning," and kept working without the flinch she might have expected, without the satisfaction she might have deserved from him. She didn't lead with an apology. That wasn't in her yet. She asked him flatly how he'd known. Marcus told her the truth, that he'd looked at the underlying weighting while formatting the chart, that the discrepancy was visible if you actually opened the model instead of trusting the summary tab, that he'd mentioned it to his supervisor first and been told it wasn't his job. He said this without any edge in his voice. He wasn't building toward an accusation. He was just answering the question she'd asked. Vanessa asked almost against her will, where he'd learned to read a weighting model like that. Marcus told her, plainly, that he had a degree in applied mathematics, that he'd built forecasting models at his last job before it folded, and that he'd taken the visualization role at Halden because it was steady work. And steady work was what he needed. He didn't say any of this, like it was a credential he'd been hiding to spring on her later. He said it the way you'd answer any factual question, because to him, it simply was one. She asked to see what he'd built. He hesitated, not out of pride, but out of the old instinct that offering more than what's asked for rarely goes well for people like him, and then opened his laptop and showed her the 2 clean pages he'd written 11 days earlier and never sent to anyone. The corrected weighting, the real projections, a version of slide 14 that told the truth, and, as it turned out, still made a compelling case, just an honest one, 19% instead of 34%, with a clearer path to how that number would grow. Vanessa sat with that for a long moment. She had spent 6 hours the day before in a room full of senior people trying to reverse engineer a problem this intern had already solved, alone at his kitchen table for free, on a night when nobody had asked him to. She took the 2 pages to Aldrich Chen herself, 3 days before his deadline, without waiting to be caught. She told him the truth, that the original figure had been wrong, that the error had been identified internally and corrected, and she put Marcus's revised model on the table exactly as he'd built it. She did not take credit for it. That surprised her own team more than it surprised Aldrich. Being early and honest with a bad number, it turned out, read completely differently than being caught with one. Aldrich's fun didn't walk away. He said later that the correction and the fact that Vanessa brought it to him before he found it was the reason he stayed in the deal at all. Coresight closed its funding round 2 weeks after that, at a number smaller than the fantasy version, but real, stable, and built on math that could survive scrutiny. The company didn't collapse. It got smaller and truer, which in the long run was the only version of it that was ever going to last. Vanessa didn't make a public show of what had happened. She wasn't built for grand gestures, and Marcus, if he'd been offered one, would have found it uncomfortable rather than gratifying. What she did instead was quieter and cost her more. She went to HR and had Marcus's role reclassified not as a favor, but as a correction to a mistake in how the company had been using him. He moved onto the modeling team the following month, at a salary that finally matched what he actually did all day. She did not frame it as an apology, exactly, but she found him in the break room a week later and told him, without an audience this time, that she'd been wrong to say what she'd said in that meeting, and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the math. She'd decided who he was before he'd finished a sentence, and it had taken almost losing the company to notice she did that as a habit, not an exception. Marcus told her it was fine. He meant it, mostly, in the way people mean things when holding a grudge has never once felt useful to them. What he didn't say, because it wasn't the kind of thing he said out loud, was that he hadn't corrected her model to prove anything. He'd done it because a wrong number bothered him more than an unkind room did. And it always had, since long before anyone in that boardroom knew his name. He kept the 2-page write-up, not framed, not displayed, just filed away in the same folder where he kept his mother's old recipe cards, and the acceptance letter to the graduate program he'd never attended. Some things you keep not because you need proof you were right, but because they mark the exact place where a long, quiet road finally turned toward something better. Being right in a room that doesn't want to hear it rarely feels like winning. But the truth doesn't need the room's permission to still be true, and sooner or later, the numbers always come due.